so nice to see a great crowd here, and it's especially nice to see a great crowd here when it's someone who's very, very important to you speaking. My name's Kate. I'm one of the co-founders and collective members here at Red Emma's. How many of you are new to this space? Okay, cool. So Red Emma's was founded in 2003 by a group of activists, artists, students, union organizers, anarchists, rabble-rousers, folks from all around the city who were excited about developing a space that was dedicated to the free exchange of information, a place that was dedicated to creating conversation, opening up lines of dialogue between different communities and different ideas, different political ideas, different social and cultural ideas. We wanted to create a place where people could come together and could talk to each other about what was going on in their communities, what was going on around the country, what was going on internationally, and anything that they were really thinking about. We opened up in a tiny basement storefront in Mount Vernon, an historic center of the city, in 2004. And then fast forward 10 years, here we are in this gorgeous new space that we opened up in November, actually, of last year. So we're not even in this space for a full year yet, but there will be a giant party in November when we get to our 10-year and 1-year anniversary. So keep your eye out for that. And over the years, we have tried as much as possible to create spaces dedicated to dialogue. We have a family of 4 projects now. There's Red Emma's Bookstore Coffee House, which is where you are tonight. There is the 2640 Project, which is a community events venue up in Charles Village that we run in partnership with St. John's United Methodist Church. We have the Baltimore Free School, which is a free educational space where anyone can teach and anyone can learn, and there's no exchange of money. That actually takes place primarily in that room right over there. We've got a full calendar of courses going on, so be sure to check that out. And then our newest member of the family of Red Emma's projects is Thread Coffee. It's a coffee roasting project based here in the space, and it's dedicated to transparent models of trade. So actually bringing coffee, which is the second most traded commodity in the world, into the country in collaboration with farmers, with folks that are actually growing the coffee and making sure that they are paid a fair wage and a fair price for the products they produce. Red Emma's itself is a worker cooperative, so everybody you see working behind the counter, everybody you see over here selling books, everybody, for the most part, that you see up here introducing events, is a member of the co-op. That means we're all equal owners and we all share equally in the management of this project. We don't have any bosses here. We have all workers on an egalitarian and even playing field. And that's very important to us, and it's something that we like to tell people anytime they come into the space. There are a ton of amazing events that happen in this space all throughout the week, all throughout the year. Please be sure to grab an events calendar, and there are some up here right by the register. And I also just want to point out that we have a massive event, our biggest event of the year, which is coming up next weekend. It's the Radical Book Fair Pavilion at the Baltimore Book Festival. So about 6 or 7 years ago, the Baltimore Book Festival, which is the big city-sponsored book fest that takes place every year, said, "Hey, Red Emma's, do you guys want to do some programming?" And we were like, "Yeah, you can give us a stage and tents in the middle of the book festival? That's awesome." So we've been doing that for 7 years. We bring radical, lefty, political folks from all over the country and locally together for a weekend of what we like to call a celebration of informed resistance. So that takes place next weekend. This year it's in the Inner Harbor. Strangely, because Mount Vernon is under renovation, so it'll be down in the Inner Harbor. We have the Baltimore Youth Poetry Team kicking that off on Friday night. We have all kinds of folks from all around the country speaking on Saturday. And then on Sunday, we have all local authors this year. So please be sure to check the calendar. There are some amazing talks lined up. I hope you guys can come out for it. On to tonight. We are absolutely thrilled and honored to be welcoming Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz to Baltimore and to Red Emma's. This is something that we wanted to see for a long time. We're huge fans of Roxanne and her work. She's someone who's been influential for me personally and for other members of the collective, and it's just a real treat to actually be able to have her here, especially to talk about this new book, Indigenous People's History of the United States. Robin Kelly, in his blurb of the book, said something to the effect of, I don't remember the exact line, but something to the effect of, this may well be the most important book of U.S. history think that's true. I don't think that's an exaggeration. The most important books of history are the ones that challenge us, are the ones that ask us to think in a completely different way, ask us to push through, overturn, overcome the dominant narratives that have silenced so many voices all throughout history. What Roxanne's book does is really challenge the conspiracy of silence that has limited the voices of the Indigenous folks of the United States since the founding of this country, since before the founding of this country. And it's truly, truly an accomplishment to have this book out. It's truly a fantastic opportunity for all of us to get to hear Roxanne talk about this, to participate in Q&A afterwards and ask questions and start a conversation, and to try and break through that conspiracy of silence. So thank you all again so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Roxanne Dunbar.
Here is amazing, so I'm very excited and to have some dearly beloved relatives here and friends and then new friends, and of course Kate, who we very much miss in the Bay Area, where I spent a lot of time there. Well, yeah, this book is a history of the United States from an Indigenous people's perspective. So it is a history of the United States. And it's a part of a series from Beacon Press. Beacon Press that published this book is a wonderful press. It's a Universalist Unitarian Church-owned press. It's very old. It's from the 1840s, and they publish really amazing things that no other mainstream publisher publishes. So I'm really feel fortunate. They published, for instance, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States initially in 1980. And before Howard passed away, he suggested that they do a series of people's histories. And he particularly wanted to see an Indigenous people's history, and he suggested me as the author because I unrelentingly criticized him for his long spaces when he leaves off with Wounded Knee and Tragic Wounding in 1890, and for the next almost 70 years, nothing. Then they pop up at Alcatraz, and I said, what were they doing all that time? And so I think he decided to curse me with this task. And I've been working on it for 7 years. It was really a difficult book to write because, it's impossible to represent the perspective of even one Native American, much less more than 500 Native nations in North America. But I think it is a consensus view that is expressed here, and so far it's been really well received by Native people. Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that we're in this city, but this land under here is actually the unceded, and that word means stolen, traditional land of the Piscataway Nation of farmers and fishers who had inhabited the area for 10,000 of years before the invasion. So we should always remember whose people's land we're on, wherever we are at any time. The Canadian Native people have pounded that into me. We don't do that here, but You'll rarely ever hear a person, any Canadian, make a public talk in Canada without first saying whose land they're on, even if there are no Native people there anymore. It's been completely stolen. It's very important to remember. So I'm going to read from a chapter. It's hard to decide what to read, but I want to read. I decided for what I imagine to be the Red Emma turnout to read from the Doctrine of Discovery, the chapter, the Doctrine of Discovery. And the reason I'm reading from paper is because my eyesight is not great enough to read my own book. No, it is, but it's just kind of hard, so I enlarge the print and I read from my printout. So in 1982, the government of Spain and the Holy See, that is the Vatican, which is a non-voting state member of the United Nations, they proposed to the UN General Assembly that year that 1992 be celebrated in the United Nations as an encounter between Europe and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, honoring Europeans for having brought the gifts of civilization and Christianity. To the shock of the North Atlantic states that supported Spain's resolution, including the United States and Canada, the entire African delegation walked out of the meeting and returned about an hour later with an impassioned statement condemning a proposal to celebrate colonialism in the United Nations, which was established for the purpose of ending colonialism. The doctrine of discovery had reared its head in the wrong place. The resolution was dead, but it was not the end of efforts by Spain, the Vatican, and others in the West to make the quincentennial a cause for celebration. Only 5 years before the debacle in the UN General Assembly, the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas Conference at the United Nations, Geneva headquarters, had proposed that 1992 be made the UN Year of Mourning for the onset of colonialism, African slavery, and genocide against the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and that October 12th be designated as the UN International Day for the world's indigenous peoples. As the time drew near to the quincentennial, Spain took the lead in fighting the indigenous proposal. They spent a lot of money trying to defeat that proposal that we're putting forward. Spain and the Vatican also spent years and huge amounts of money preparing for their own celebration of Columbus, enlisting the help of all of the countries of Latin America, except Cuba, which refused, and paid for this in withdrawn Spanish financial investments. Fidel Castro said, "There are only two sides, the side of the colonizer and the side of the colonized, and we have to be on the side of the colonized." In the United States, the George H.W. Bush administration cooperated with the project and produced its own series of events. In the end, compromise won at the United Nations. Indigenous peoples garnered a decade for the world's indigenous peoples, which officially began in 1994, but was inaugurated at UN headquarters in New York in December 1992. August 9th, not October 12th, was designated as an annual UN International Day for the world's indigenous peoples. And the Nobel Peace Prize went to Guatemalan Mayan leader Rigoberto Menchú, announced in Oslo on October 12, 1992. A decision that infuriated the Spanish government and the Vatican. The organized celebrations of Columbus flopped, thanks to multiple highly visible protests by indigenous peoples all over the Western Hemisphere and their allies. Particularly, support grew for the work for indigenous peoples at the United Nations to develop new international law standards to promote the self-determination of indigenous peoples. According to the centuries-old doctrine of discovery, European nations acquired title to the lands they, quote, discovered. And indigenous inhabitants lost their natural right to that land after Europeans had arrived and claimed it. Under this legal cover for theft, Euro-American wars of conquest and settler colonialism devastated indigenous nations and communities, ripping their territories away from them and transforming the land into private property, real estate. Most of that land ended up in the hands of land speculators and agribusiness operators, many of which, up to the mid-19th century, were plantations worked by another form of private property, enslaved Africans. Arcane as it may seem, the doctrine of discovery remains the basis for federal laws still in effect that control indigenous people's lives and destinies, even their histories, by distorting them. So where did this doctrine of discovery come from? From the mid-15th century to the mid-20th century, most of the non-European world was colonized under the doctrine of discovery. One of the first principles of international law Christian European monarchies promulgated to legitimize investigating, mapping, and claiming lands belonging to peoples outside of Europe. It originated in a papal bull issued in 1455 that permitted the Portuguese monarchy to seize West Africa. Following Columbus's infamous exploratory voyage in 1492, sponsored by the King and Queen of the infant Spanish state, another papal bull extended similar permission to Spain. Disputes between the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies led to the papal-initiated Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which, besides dividing the globe equally between the two Iberian empires, clarified that only non-Christian lands fell under the discovery doctrine. The doctrine on which all European states relied thus originated with the arbitrary and unilateral establishment of the Iberian monarchies. Exclusive rights under Christian canon law to colonize foreign peoples, and the right was later seized by other European and, of course, the British monarchical colonizing projects. The French Republic used this legalistic instrument for its 19th and 20th century settler colonialist projects, as did the newly independent United States when it continued the colonization of North America begun by the British. In 1792, not long after the U.S. founding, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed that the doctrine of discovery developed by the European states was international law applicable to the new U.S. government as well. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Johnson versus McIntosh. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Marshall held that the doctrine of discovery had been an established principle of European law and of English law in effect in Britain's North American colonies, and was also the law of the United States. The court defined the exclusive property rights that a European country acquired by dint of discovery. Quote, discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. Therefore, European and Euro-American discoverers had gained real property rights in the lands of indigenous peoples by merely planting a flag. Indigenous rights were, in the court's words, quote, in no instance entirely disregarded, but were necessarily to a considerable extent impaired. The court further held that indigenous rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations were necessarily diminished. Indigenous peoples could continue to live on the land, but title resided with the discovering power, the United States. The decision concluded that Native nations were, quote, domestic dependent nations, something never heard of in the world before. Soon it turned out that the indigenous nation in question, Cherokee, was not allowed to live on its land. It was deported on the Trail of Tears, followed by the Muskogee peoples. The doctrine of discovery is so taken for granted that it is rarely mentioned in historical or legal texts published in the Americas. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, which meets annually for 2 weeks, devoted its entire 2012 session to the doctrine of discovery. 3 decades earlier, as indigenous peoples of the Americas began asserting their presence in the UN human rights system, they had proposed such a conference and study. The World Council of Churches, the Unitarian Universalist Church, the Episcopal Church, and other Protestant religious institutions responding to demands from indigenous peoples have made statements disassociating themselves with the doctrine of discovery. The New York Society of Friends, the Quakers, in denying the legitimacy of the doctrine, asserted in 2012 that it clearly still has the force of law today and is not simply a medieval relic. The Quakers pointed out that the United States rationalizes its claims to sovereignty over Native nations. For instance, in the 2005 U.S. Supreme Court case, City of Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation of Indians. The statement asserts, we cannot accept that the doctrine of discovery was ever a true authority for the forced taking of lands and the enslavement or extermination of peoples. The Unitarian Universal Association resolution regarding this is particularly powerful and an excellent model. They repudiate the doctrine of discovery as a relic of colonialism, feudalism, and religious, cultural, and racial bias, having no place in modern-day treatment of indigenous peoples. The Unitarians resolved to expose the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery, and to eliminate its presence in contemporary politics, programs, theologies, and structures. They additionally encouraged other religious bodies to reject the use of the doctrine of discovery to dominate indigenous peoples, and resolved to collaborate with groups to propose a specific congressional resolution to repudiate its doctrine and call upon the United States to fully implement the standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in U.S. law and policy without qualifications. Refer to the, earlier in the book, I explained the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was passed by the UN General Assembly in 2007 after 30 years of very hard work on the part of indigenous peoples for that result. And Monday and Tuesday we have a high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York, heads of state, to discuss how to implement and strengthen the declaration. I'm going to come to that. U.S. officials get tangled in the contradictions inherent in the attempt to legitimize empire building through the doctrine of discovery and the origin story of making a clear break from the British Empire. The rhetoric is often baffling, particularly when it references U.S. American cultural memory of the wars against Native nations, as it did in following the declaration of the War on Terror after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. In early 2011, a Yemeni citizen, Ali Hamza al-Bahoud, was serving a life sentence at Guantanamo as a, quote, enemy combatant. A military tribunal having convicted him of crimes associated with his service to al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden's media secretary. In arguing on appeal that Bahoud's conviction be upheld, a Pentagon lawyer, Navy Captain Edward S. White, relied on a precedent from an 1818 tribunal. In his 37-page military commission's brief, Captain White wrote, quote, not only was the Seminole belligerency unlawful, but much like modern-day al-Qaeda, the very way in which the Seminoles waged war against the U.S. targets, itself violated the customs and usages of war. The Center for Constitutional Rights objected to this passage in the government's brief, stating, "The court should reject the government's notable reliance on the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, a genocide that led to the Trail of Tears. The government's characterization of Native American resistance to the United States as much like modern-day Al-Qaeda is not only factually wrong, but overtly racist, and cannot present any legitimate legal basis to uphold Mr. Baua's conviction." In response, the Pentagon's General Counsel issued a letter stating that the U.S. government stood by its precedent. So this isn't just history, this book. This is present-day reality. In the United States, indigenous nations and communities that seek political autonomy or even independence engage in nation building. That is, developing indigenous governments and an economic base. The central concern for indigenous peoples in the United States is prevailing upon the federal government to honor hundreds of treaties and other agreements concluded between the United States and indigenous nations as between two sovereign states. Demands to have treaties and agreements upheld have never abated, and they have accelerated since the end of the termination era. The termination era was in the 1950s. In 1953, U.S. Congress passed, and they actually called it the Termination Act, to terminate Native Americans completely, forever, as such, and to do away with their land-based governance and everything. This was then produced an enormous resistance movement that culminated in the reversal of termination in the early 1970s. But a lot of damage was done, and a number of reservations were terminated. Unfortunately, few outside the Native community know that viable treaties and agreements exist and have the weight of domestic and international law. Following the 1973 2.5-month standoff at Wounded Knee, the American Indian movement brought together more than 5,000 indigenous representatives, including from South America, Central America, and the Pacific, in a 10-day gathering that founded the International Indian Treaty Council, which then applied for and received United Nations non-governmental consultative status in 1975. The IITC proceeded to organize the first conference to be held at the United Nations on Indigenous People in 1977. This international indigenous work at the United Nations grew slowly at first, but by the mid-1980s it was attracting grassroots indigenous representatives from around the world and constructing important initiatives. The global indigenous cause reached a milestone in 2007 with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Only 4 UN member states voted in opposition, all of them Anglo-settler states: the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. All 4, with some embarrassment, later changed their votes to approval, making little notes at the bottom. But self-determination for Native nations doesn't mean the same thing as self-determination in international law. The whole point of the Declaration, to sign an exception to it. For indigenous peoples in North America, an important action within the United Nations was the 1987 mandate given to the UN Special Rapporteur, Miguel Alfonso Martinez, to investigate the status of treaties and agreements between indigenous nations and the original colonial powers and national governments that now claim authority over indigenous nations. The UN study on treaties, completed in 1999, is a useful tool for indigenous peoples in the United States in their continuing struggle for land restoration and sovereignty. The investigation concluded that indigenous treaty rights in the United States have contemporary effective status. The special rapporteur based this finding largely on the U.S. Constitution, which in Article 6 provides that all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. And Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution explicitly includes relations with indigenous nations as among the powers of Congress. That is, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. With a large part of indigenous nations' territories and resources in what is now the United States taken through aggressive war, outright theft, and legislative appropriations, Native peoples have vast claims to land restitution. Indigenous nations negotiated numerous treaties with the United States that included land concessions and monetary compensation. But the remaining indigenous territories have steadily shrunk due to direct federal appropriation by various means, as well as through government failure to meet its obligation to protect indigenous land holdings as required under treaties. The United States government has acknowledged some of these claims and has offered only monetary compensation. However, since the upsurge of the Indian rights movement in the 1960s, indigenous nations have demanded restoration of treaty-guaranteed land rather than monetary compensation. No monetary amount can compensate for lands illegally seized, particularly those sacred lands necessary for indigenous peoples to regain social coherence. In addition to land and sacred sites, another important form of restitution is that of the remains of dead ancestors and burial items. After considerable struggle, Congress enacted the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which requires that museums and other institutions return human remains and burial items to the appropriate indigenous communities. However, indigenous governments must initiate lawsuits if the institutions holding the burial remains do not volunteer repatriation, and many have not. Land claims and treaty rights are the most central to indigenous people's fight for justice in the United States. The case of the Great Sioux Nation exemplifies the persistence among indigenous nations and communities to protect their sovereignty and culture. The Sioux have never accepted the validity of the U.S. confiscation of Pahasaba, the Black Hills. Mount Rushmore, with carvings in the granite rocks, is controversial among Native Americans, not only for what it depicts, but because it is carved out of the sacred Black Hills. Members of the American Indian movement led occupations of the monument beginning in 1971. Return of the Black Hills was a major Sioux demand in 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. Due to a decade of intense protests and occupations by the Sioux, on July 23, 1980, in the United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been illegally taken and that remuneration equal to the initial offering price plus interest, which came to about $106 million, be paid. Well, now that was embarrassing enough, to only offer what was worth it taking in the 1870s. But even if it had been much more, the Sioux refused the award and continued to demand the return of the Black Hills. They didn't ask for more money, they asked for the Black Hills back. The money remained in an interest-bearing account, which by 2010 amounted to more than $757 million. The Sioux believed that accepting the money would validate the U.S. theft of their most sacred land. The Sioux Nation's determination for repatriation of the Black Hills attracted renewed media attention in 2011. A segment of the PBS NewsHour titled, "For the Great Sioux Nation, the Black Hills Can't Be Bought for $1.3 billion." That's how much it had accrued in interest. And it aired that year. The reporter described a Sioux reservation, their reservations. It used to be one, the Great Sioux Nation, been broken up into very small, separated reservations. The reporter described a Sioux reservation as one of the most difficult places in which to live in the United States. He stated, few people in the Western Hemisphere have shorter life expectancies. Males on average live to 48 years old, females to 52. Almost half of all people above the age of 40 have diabetes. And the economic realities are even worse. Unemployment rates are consistently above 80%. Inside the Pine Ridge Reservation, half of children live in poverty, and the average income is $8,000 a year. But there are, he goes on, there are funds available, a federal pot now worth more than $1 billion, that sits here in the U.S. Treasury Department waiting to be collected. The money stems from a 1980 Supreme Court ruling that set aside money to compensate Sioux for the taking of the Black Hills in 1877. The only problem, the Sioux never wanted the money because the land was never for sale. It was a very good program. You can watch it streaming on PBS. But just think about it, one of the most impoverished communities in the whole of the Americas, it's right there with Haiti, Honduras, the poorest countries, would refuse $1 billion, demonstrates the relevance and significance of the sacred land to the Sioux, not as an economic resource, but as a relationship between people and place, a profound feature of the resilience of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The astonishment of outsiders that the Sioux would refuse the money brings up the narrative of dysfunction associated with Native Americans, both on reservations and in urban areas where half the Native American population lives at any one time. The mainstream media and books regularly expose and denounce the poverty and social dysfunction found in indigenous communities. Rates of alcoholism and suicide are far higher than national averages, and higher even than in other communities living in poverty. In a book of case studies of poverty and neglected sites of deterioration in the United States, journalist Chris Hedges offered me a passionate account of the Pine Ridge Reservation as a site of extreme poverty, but not as a colony. As well-meaning and accurate as such portrayals may be, they miss the specific circumstances that reproduce indigenous poverty and social scarring, namely the colonial condition. As Vine Deloria Jr. and other Native American activists and scholars have emphasized, there is a direct link between the suppression of indigenous sovereignty and the powerlessness manifest in depressed social conditions. Deloria explained that for the Sioux, everyone has responsibility and rituals to perform that involve a particular geography. In their case, this means sites in the Black Hills. According to Deloria, some of the holy men up there will say that a lot of the social problems with the Sioux are the result of losing the Black Hills. So you couldn't perform your duties and become a contributor to the ongoing creation. And consequently, people began to fall away, and they started to suffer, and they started to fight among themselves. In continuing to disregard treaty rights and deny restitution of sacred lands such as the Black Hills, the federal government prevents indigenous communities from performing their most elemental responsibilities as inscribed in their cultural and religious teachings. In other words, sovereignty equals survival, nationhood instead of genocide. Ethnographer Nancy Lurie provocatively described Indian drinking as the world's oldest ongoing protest demonstration. The effects of continued colonization form similar patterns among indigenous communities throughout the Americas, as well as among the Maori, New Zealand, Australian Aborigines, and the Irish. And the popular notion of Indian Black community and alcohol is obviously bogus. The experience of generations of Native Americans in on and off reservation boarding schools run by the federal government or Christian missions contributed significantly to the family and social dysfunction still found in Native communities. Generations of child abuse, including sexual abuse, from the founding of the first schools by missionaries in the 1830s and by the federal government in 1875 until most were closed and the remaining ones reformed in the 1970s, traumatized survivors and their progeny. In 2002, a coalition of Indigenous groups started the Boarding School Healing Project, which documented through research and oral history the extensive abuses that go beyond individual casualties to disruption of Indigenous life at every level. Sun Elk was the first child from a very traditional house pueblo to attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, spending 7 years there beginning in 1883. After a harsh re-entry into Taos society, he told his story. He said, "They told us that the Indian ways were bad. They said we must get civilized. I remember that word too. It means be like the white man. I'm willing to be like the white man, but I did not believe Indian ways were wrong. But they kept teaching us for 7 years, and the books told how bad the Indians had been to the white men, burning their towns and killing their women and children. But that's what I had seen white men do to Indians. We all wore white men's clothes and ate white men's food and went to white men's churches and spoke white men's talk. And so after a while, we also began to say Indians were bad. We laughed at our own people and their blankets and cooking pots and secret societies and dancing." Ponca historian Roger Buffalo Head verifies these testimonies of many people, especially of the beatings, the corporal punishment, saying the idea of corporal punishment, so foreign to traditional Indian cultures, became a way of life for those students returning from their educational experience. Yet you find by the 30s and 40s in most Native communities where large numbers of young people had in the previous years attended boarding schools, an increasing number of parents who utilized corporal punishment in the raising of their children, so that although you can't prove a direct connection, I think you can certainly see that boarding school experiences where corporal punishment was the name of the game had their impact on the next generations of Native people. Sexual abuse of both boys and girls was also rampant. One woman remembered, "We had many different teachers during those years. Some got the girls pregnant and had to leave. One teacher would put his arm around, fondle this girl, sometimes picking her on his lap. When I got there, Mr. M put his arm around me and rubbed my arm all the way down. He rubbed his face against mine." At one mission school, a priest was known for sexual advances. Anyway, I ended up beside him, and all of a sudden, he was upon me. So I pushed him away. Much documentation, testimony attests to the never-ending resistance by children in boarding schools. Running away was the most common way to resist, but there were also acts of non-participation and sabotage, secretly speaking their languages and practicing ceremonies. This surely accounts for their survival, but the damage is nearly incomprehensible. Mohawk historian Ivy Alfred asked, "What is the legacy of colonialism? Dispossession, disempowerment, and disease, inflicted by the white man to be sure, yet the enemy is in plain view. Residential schools, racism, expropriation, extinguishment, warfare, welfare." Indigenous women in particular have continued to bear the brunt of sexual violence, both within families and by settler predators. Incidents of rape on and near reservations has long been astronomical. The colonialist restrictions on Indigenous policing authority on reservations, yet another legacy of the doctrine of discovery and the experiment of Indigenous sovereignty, opened the door to perpetrators of sexual violence who knew there would be no consequences for their action. Under the U.S. colonial system, jurisdiction for crimes committed on Native lands falls to federal and state authorities because Native justice can be applied only to reservation residents and then only for misdemeanors. 1 in 3 Native American women has been raped or experienced attempted rape, and the rate of sexual assault on Native American women is more than twice the national average. For 5 years after publication of a scathing 2007 report by Amnesty International, Native American women's organizations, including the National Organization for Women, lobbied Congress to add a new section to the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, addressing the special situation of Native American women living on reservations. The added provision would allow Native Nations court jurisdiction to arrest and prosecute non-Native men who enter reservations and commit rape. At the end of 2012, the Republican-dominated U.S. Congress denied reauthorization of the act because it included that provision. In March 2013, however, that opposition was overcome, and President Barack Obama signed the amended act back into law. So this was a small step for Native sovereignty. The Republicans knew it and did not want it to happen, but how can you be for violence against women? You know, it just, they couldn't quite bring themselves to sort of exposing what that's why it's very important to know that the general population actually has not very much investment in the restrictions of Native sovereignty. But the government does, and it does rely on the doctrine of discovery and has that colonial lock that it does not intend to give up without pressure, like the National Organization for Women. They really got in there and fought for this. For generations, Native nations, occasionally with the help of federal or state government, treated the symptoms of colonialism, but with the powerful indigenous self-determination movements in the second half of the 20th century, those nations participated in drafting and instituting new international law that supports their aspirations, and they began working on shoring up their sovereignty through governance. Through this work, U.S. indigenous peoples have reconceptualized their forms of government based on new constitutions that reflect their specific cultures. Novel thinking on a future constitution expresses that desire. Like some other Native nations, the Navajo, the most populous and the one holding the largest land base in the United States, has never had a constitution. But others do have constitutions similar to that were imposed upon them by the United States. Nearly 60 Native nations adopted constitutions before 1934. Following the Indian Reorganization Act of that year, another 130 Native nations wrote constitutions according to federal guidelines and without the active participation of their citizenry. So just in the past few years, the Osage Nation has engaged in a contentious and difficult process involving all of the people in a reform that produced a new and much more democratic constitution. I'll just read the preamble because I think it's, gives you a sense of the quality of these new constitutions. We, the Washashi, also known as the Osage people, have formed as clans in the far distance past, have been a people, and as a people have walked the earth in joy and blessings, have walked for more centuries than we truly know. Having resolved to live in harmony, we now come together so that we may once more unite as a nation and as a people, calling upon the fundamental values that we hold sacred: justice, fairness, compassion, respect for and protection of child, elder, all fellow beings, and self. Paying homage to generations of Osage leaders in the past and present, we give thanks for their wisdom and courage. Acknowledging our ancient tribal order as the foundation of our present government, first reformed in the 1881 Constitution of the Osage Nation, we continue our legacy by again reorganizing our government. This Constitution, created by the Osage people, hereby grants to every Osage citizen a vote that is equal to all others, and form of a government that is accountable to the citizens of the Osage Nation. We, the Osage people, based on centuries of being a people, now strengthen our government in order to preserve and perpetuate a full and abundant Osage way of life that benefits all Osages, living and as yet unborn. So the doctrine of discovery is dissolving in light of Indigenous peoples' profound acts of sovereignty. But neither arcane colonial laws nor the historical trauma of genocide simply disappear with time. Certainly not when conditions of life and consciousness perpetuate them. The Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty movement is not only transforming the continent's Indigenous communities and nations, but also inevitably the United States of America.
Now it's on. So thank you, Roxanne. We are going to have, we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So the way that we like to do this here is we've got a microphone up here because it's so hard to hear if folks are just speaking unamplified. So if you have a question, we're going to ask you to come and just line up here, and we'll ask folks to keep their comments and questions short so that we can get a variety of voices. And if anyone does have a mobility issue, just raise your hand and I'll come over and we'll figure out a way to get a mic to you, or we'll have you just stand up and ask everybody to listen very carefully. So if anyone has questions, just come on up and
Hello. I contend what happened in North America had anthropological and philosophical reasons. That being that the Europeans came here with the concept that ownership of land is important as human, more importantly, as human life. And the Native Americans or Indians, even though they warred with each other sometimes, collectively they had a concept of the land that was very similar. And that was that I could no more own the land than the air I breathe. And those two philosophical point of views cannot go hand in hand. So what happened, in my perception of what happened with the Europeans, is that genocide had happened. Because those two philosophical points of views could not exist with them wanting to do what they wanted to do and philosophical concepts they had. So the idea that genocide had happened makes us now, without our living, breathing concept of I can no more own the land than the air I breathe, even though all of us would think that's a good idea and that we love it because we have no living, breathing, cultural manifestation of that, we really don't have a concept of that.
Yeah, I think in the beginning of the book, in the introduction, I introduced some theories about settler colonialism. It's a particular kind of colonialism, not the majority kind of colonialism, say in South Asia, in most of Asia, and even most of Africa, Southern Africa. These were administrators mostly who came, but the Anglo colonies were separate colonies. Also some Spanish later on, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay. And it's inherently eliminationist because the idea is to replacement people, bringing settlers to the land, to eliminate those already on the land. And the thing is that, they made all these rationalizations, but in fact, the native people were overwhelmingly majority were farmers who lived in towns. They made it seem like it was empty land. Made people, were like hunters running around in the forest. And these are very, advanced civilizations. And even in the areas of the bison people, very advanced governance and territoriality, clearly marked throughout the plains, and fishing peoples of the coast. So every inch of land was occupied collectively by Native nations. And the United States had to fight, had to make war on every single, to get every inch of land. There was resistance. But that eliminationism is inherently genocidal. It has a genocidal motive, as a method of elimination.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming to Baltimore and Red Emma's to speak on your book. It's incredible to have you here. I had 2 questions. First, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your research methods for the book. What process did you go through when, pulling up information about history? Who did you interview? How did that go? And my second, one is rhetorical. My second question is, did you find any kind of conversation, or can you talk about international solidarity movements between Indigenous people? And my third one, which is rhetorical, is how do I stop paying my federal taxes?
My process, I'm a historian. I have a doctorate in history. So as a graduate student, back in the 60s, or prior to our movements, Native peoples were really not subjects of historical work. I never forget when I went to UCLA and I said I wanted to specialize in Latin American history so I could study colonial land tenure in Mexico and compare it to Indigenous peoples' land tenure. And they said, you might want to think about going to the anthropology department. And I said, why? I'm a historian. Had my BA degree in history. Why would I do that? But they had this specialized ghetto, for studying the mores of Indigenous peoples. So they were not subjects of history. And then there was a category called Western history, history of the West, cowboys and Indians, And so those are just this Plains Indian Wars. So it was very difficult to find any kind of mentorship. In fact, it was impossible. So I kind of had to, fortunately, as time went on in the middle 60s, I found mentors from Biden Gloria, Howard Adams, and Jack Forrest, and others, who were got involved in building Native American studies. It seemed like the best strategy was to build Native American studies that didn't have an effect, and I think that strategy has actually worked. The department I helped build at the institution where I taught, California State University, Hayward. The history department suddenly started, wanting to have courses because ours were very successful, and we had it written into our into the program of the school that any department that wanted to teach a course on Native American that concerned Native Americans had to come and consult with us. They really hated that, but they did. And so that's the struggles we went through to make Native peoples subjects of history, rather than just obstacles to settlement, and or dead people, long ago people and no longer living human societies. So my own process in doing this book is, it's a special kind of book in that it's a broad overview, and my strategy for it, having done this international work, was to put both the United States and Native nations in a global context of the last 500 years of colonialism. So I go through, the first chapter is on the culture of conflict. Well, the first chapter is on before the Europeans came and followed the corn. And the next is the culture of conquest, where I go through the Crusades, building up of European colonialism and imperialism, the Christian Crusades, and particularly relevant to the United States is the British conquest of Ireland and the genocide committed there. And then, set the stage for all of these institutions that were brought to the Americas by the Spanish, Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English had already been practiced in Europe, in Spain, on the Moors and the Jews, the expulsion of the Moors and Jews, the creation of a doctrine of limpieza de sangre, the cleanliness of blood, the slave enslavement that was already going on by the Portuguese in the 14th century of African slave trade. So I make that context and then move on to a history of the United States. I kind of changed the standard periodization, not as much as I think needs to be changed, but this book is meant to be very accessible, to be able to be used even in high schools, and an abridged version is going to be created for middle schools and for teachers, study guides, and to not make it so esoteric that you have no grounding in reading it, that it's just alienating, so that there are markers in it that are familiar, and then to try to subvert them, thinking of the framework that already exists. So that's kind of the strategy. And then I have a kind of core chapter in the book on Andrew Jackson and the period of removal. And not just Andrew Jackson as president, but from the time he was the head of the Tennessee militia in 1811, his genocidal campaigns against the Muskogee people and Cherokees, and through to his being a major general and the Army, his attack on the Seminole Nation, and then his popular election, populist imperialism, I call it, and then his 2 terms in which he implemented what he advocated from the very beginning, and that was the total deportation of all the Native people east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. And that he pretty much accomplished during his 8 years of presidency. And, he still go to an ATM machine, you'll see Andrew Jackson every day, the $20 bill. So I'm advocating that we get rid of Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. I'm not sure we want any Native person on there because it's $1, but I put a star or something, anything but Andrew Jackson.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Seminole Wars, and if you go to Iwo Jima, there's a statue, the flag raising there. Ira Hayes is one of the figures there, being Indian. I started reading the book on it. He's the one his hands are not quite touching the flag. He's one of the guys in the back.
Yeah.
And in the back of my head, I was kind of thinking, maybe he doesn't really want to.
Right.
Maybe he just, the camera, he's there. But at the bottom, what strikes me is at the bottom of that, they have all the wars, all the conflicts that the Marines have been in to this day. The 4 Seminole Wars are one of them.
Right.
That is listed there. I always thought that was very ironic. But when you talk about about how, and I guess I got a feeling that, doctrine of discovery was kind of slowly being chipped away at. But I'm wondering about, with the underfunding of the Indian Health Service and the cutbacks for Indian affairs, although there have been some little funding put in, it always reminds you of Malcolm X's statement when he talks about when you pull the knife out, the knife's in 12 inches, you pull out 6 inches, you're not really healing. when you take it out all the way and you put some sand in it, that's easy. And so I'm wondering, are the Indian wars still going on?
Well, you know, it's hard to know where we are historically because there were all these, it seemed like a roll of success, even under Nixon, you know, having the Indian Self-Determination Act. Of course, right after that, there was the March on Washington, the Trail of Broken Trees, where they said, okay, Nixon, let's go a little farther than that, not just in education, but how about the treaties? So they occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he put a Native American embassy on it took out some very damning documents. But there was Wounded Knee, but you know, then there was this COINTELPRO program of the FBI where they attacked the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement. They were both listed as #1 terrorist organization, domestic terrorist organization. And what that really means is, you know, it's almost like the old Anglo outlawing that any policeman, you know, could kill any of them because they're terrorists. They were enemy combatants, you know, and that was in the 1970s. So we have better healthcare in prison for life, we never get out, and so they tied everyone up in courts. And by 1978, there were 19 bills in Congress to, one way or another, terminate Native peoples. It was just incredible how quickly the backlash came. And then all during the Reagan years, the kind of privatization and turning over, you know, for kind of defederalizing and giving to the states and giving to the tribes a lot of grants, which we could, you know, really reduce the funding. I think because, you know, this wisdom of the elders in 1974 to form the international move, it's made it much more difficult for the United States because we're now out there in the diplomatic world. And it's, I think, for other indigenous peoples too, to be able to circumvent the domestic relationship and get into the international relationship. We've been able to accomplish a lot in terms of world support, world consciousness, and keeping an eye out. We have a UN Special Rapporteur just on indigenous peoples to check up on governments and make reports. And even though they'll try to tell you, the press, educators, the U.S. government itself, that the U.S. pays no attention to international law or the UN, they do. All countries do. And they just tell you that so you will not think you have any redress outside of domestic law, but you do. You have rights under international law, rights of the child, rights of women, rights of indigenous peoples, rights against racist actions, the right to food, the right to peace, the right to support countries to development. So this is very important, you know, in a time when there's a move toward totalitarianism in this country that there, you know, it can be circumvented. And I think had it not been for that, the intention of the backlash was to really another termination era. And I don't think they could do that now. I don't think they could get by with it. And this became truly a fascist dictatorship in which we're also screwed. We can't even imagine what to do at that moment. But I do think that not only that, but the movement of indigenous peoples, it's interesting, the climate change convergence is taking place at the United Nations. It's kind of accidental they ended up in the same beginning of the General Assembly. There's a huge march on Sunday and a large contingent of indigenous peoples in it. And, you know, the Keystone Pipeline and all the fracking and everything through the whole middle of the country, and in the Northwest British Columbia and state of Washington. These, so much of this is on native land, and so there are lots of, have you heard of the Cowboy Indian Alliance? It's called the CIA. The new CIA is wonderful. They came and put teepees on the mall last fall, and this was really important alliance in the plains of the ranchers and the native people uniting and this is important for all of us, that this, this crazy insistence on taking out every single drop of fossil fuels possible, just really damage, blowing up the mountaintops for coal, fracking, causing earthquakes, and my home place, Oklahoma, now has about 10 earthquakes a week, small ones, under 3. Never had an earthquake the whole time I was growing up there, never felt an earthquake, and now they have them constantly, and it's from fracking. So what Native people are doing, the struggle of Native people, is important to everyone, but the strengthening of sovereignty of Native nations is also important to everyone, not just to Native people. Because if there's going to be a real structural change in the United States, there has to be some kind of evolution of the United States. And it needs to start with native territories and build around that. And I was very encouraged by what, even though the Scottish independence lost, they did get a promise from the Westminster that they're now going to, even Wales and Northern Ireland, they're going to create almost total autonomy for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And I think that's a move, and that's taking place in Europe, Catalonia, and the Basque Country, and all that. I think we should try to imagine how the United States should look in about 50 years, a very different geopolitical arrangement. And if it's centered on native stewardship, like the return of at least partial control of Grand Canyon, to the Mojave Nation, why not? I'm advocating the return of all the national parks. These are all the sacred areas that were nabbed by Theodore Roosevelt. God, I hate Ken Burns. His national parks, and it's all sacred land. And maybe he was extolling how beautiful the public lands and the national park system, and Yellowstone, the Cheyenne people, the Arapaho people, and Yosemite in California, the Native people, and the Grand Tetons, and all of the Black Hills, and of course Taos Blue Lake is one of the few places that has been restored to the Native people, but the Malpai in New Mexico, the lava beds, which is sacred land for the Akamon, and Mount Taylor, all of these need to be restored. It doesn't mean that other people couldn't go there, but they would have to ask permission of the appropriate Native people, and they're having ceremonies there. People can learn to respect that, and I think it would improve everyone's consciousness and life for the better to be able to do that. But first we have to come to terms with, what makes up this country. Rahul was referring to the Marines, but we have this myth that U.S. imperialism started in 1898, not even considering the taking of half of Mexico as imperialism. That was manifest destiny, right? Just like taking all native land. And so only when they went overseas, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, was it considered overseas imperialism. But they leave out completely the Barbary Wars that started in 1801, 3 wars against the Berbers of North Africa, who just objected to U.S. merchant ships, coming along their coast without their permission. So they call them barbarians. They're Berbers, they call them barbarians. And they call them terrorists and mad, crazy people. But those 3 wars, that's when the Marine Corps that was their first mission. And it's called Tripoli. That's the main city on the North African coast. And so that Marine Corps hymn from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the Marines know that they were involved in imperialism because they wrote the hymn after the capture of Mexico City in 1847. And they held Mexico City until Mexico signed a treaty that ceded the northern half of Mexico, which is most of the western states. And so that song, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, is the Marine anthem. And it's inherent in the Marine Corps as a imperialist body to carry this out. And that was from almost day one, 1801. It was the first Barbary War. So from the very inception of the United States, it was planned and programmed as an imperialist power. It was independent. It was like when Ian Smith of Rhodesia split off from the British Empire in the 1960s and formed the state of Rhodesia when the Zimbabwe, during decolonization. And then the people of Zimbabwe had to fight for independence against this independent republic of South Rhodesia. So they broke off from the British Empire. That didn't mean they didn't continue to be colonialist. So the United States was born as an imperialist power. It's not my original idea, but William Appleton Williams and other historians, they write about this, in history texts that never get into the textbooks. It's only when you're in graduate school in history that, wow, they're saying all these things, outright, and they know them. But they teach history as civics, and you're supposed to have the origin story of the great independent republic and an anti-colonial, they even call it the first anti-colonial revolution. It wasn't anti-colonial at all. Haiti was, that was the first anti-colonial revolution in the Americas, but not the United States. It was a reactionary. There's also a new book about it being a counter-revolution, and that's based on the very great possibility that Britain they had already outlawed the international slave trade, but that they would outlaw actual chattel slavery in their colonies because it was such a huge anti-slavery movement. Plus, there were just huge revolutions, uprisings, marooners throughout the British Empire, including in the South of the United States, and that the slave owners who founded the Republic wanted to preserve their institution and as an economic base for their movement. And that was also inherently imperialistic because for plantation agriculture, agribusiness, the invention of agribusiness by colonialists throughout the Caribbean, in the South, and Brazil. They destroyed the land, with planting it one crop, and over and over and over. So really by the middle of the 18th century, Virginia was just a wasteland. So they needed more land, and then they had to drive out all of the indigenous farmers to take their land And then you had the rise of the Cotton Kingdom once they did that in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and a whole new lease on life for plantation agriculture and slavery, the most brutal kind. Millions of times more brutal than the brutality of past slave regimes further east. So that was, one faction of them moved into Nicaragua and took William Walker, declaring himself president of Nicaragua, and reintroduced slavery. In Latin America, they outlawed slavery when they became independent. Every country outlawed slavery when they became independent, and not the United States. So that's a real telling factor right there, is whether something is a real liberation movement or not. And so I think we have to understand that we're all instruments of imperialism and genocide. And it's not like it's just history, it's being repeated and repeated and repeated around the world. My favorite quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, "My country," put it during the Vietnam War, "is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world." And that's exactly still true. He also, I have a quote in the book, I had never seen this quote before, but Beacon Press actually published the Martin Luther King papers. And I was trying to, it's very hard to get permission to quote Martin Luther King in writing for more than 2 or 3 words. But because Beacon Press had the copyright, my editor sent me this, and I'd never seen it before, where he, I'll paraphrase this, I probably couldn't find it immediately in the book, but that he said, "This country was founded on genocide. It's one of the few countries in the world ever founded on the very conscious principle of genocide against the indigenous peoples." Wow, and he said that in 1964 too, not in 1967, 68, when he was getting more radicalized against the Vietnam War. It's really, the consciousness that we had at that time, and we're gaining in that generation. I think for younger people, a lot of that is no longer there. We have to rebuild that knowledge base, that kind of consciousness where and I think it's happening, but it's going to take some effort.
So Roxanne, I think we've got one more question for you if you're still okay.
Okay.
All right, so one more, and then we'll wrap up and give folks a chance to talk informally.
Yeah, first I just wanted to say I appreciated you saying what you said about Andrew Jackson. When I was a kid, my aunt and my grandma actually took a special trip to his grave so that they could spit on it. That's revenge. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you if you feel like there are legal precedents or if you see a legal way forward. I guess I don't know international law very well, which I'm excited to read your book and learn more about, but for domestic law in the U.S., and when I first heard about the reauthorization of VAWA and the rights that it gave to Native nations, I was really excited, and then I was talking to some people who do Native law, and there are all of these loopholes in it where it kind of doesn't really stand up. Like, I know one of the loopholes is if the person that the nation is prosecuting is non-Native, there has to be one non-Native person on the jury, like part of the law. And so I guess just feeling more disillusioned with thinking that that was this big step forward, and knowing that it's complicated. If you have any other examples of precedent or thinking future of U.S. laws that could change.
I should ask my lawyers here. Can you think of any? Well, I think a lot of them should change. First of all, the doctrine of discovery needs to be repudiated. It is standing Supreme Court law, domestic dependent nations. It's repeated over and over in all the, in state law sources. And until it's specifically repudiated by congressional act, which the Supreme Court itself would repudiate it, but Congress would override it. I think these other laws, you know, there are just so many, and it would kind of wipe out it could be argued, you know, that if you take out the doctrine of discovery, the domestic dependent nations theory, then, you know, kind of the whole scaffolding kind of collapses. And then, you know, you could bring in and implement the developing international law on the rights of indigenous people. One way to do that is, you know, one way to raise consciousness about the Declaration, and even for it to begin to have an impact, is for municipalities, for states, to just in their, you know, in their own constitutions and their own governance, go to, you know, boards of supervisors or whatever local authority, and ask them to implement the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have quite a few municipalities, starting with the People's Republic of Berkeley. It's always first in these things. And but we're doing it with a lot of others. And the other thing is, if any of you are lawyers or going to be lawyers, to try to bring into your pleadings in cases, even if it doesn't have to do directly with indigenous people, you find ways to bring in, because some of these rights, you know, like the right to food, the right to several, you know, a whole series of rights of protect women's rights to not be violated and so forth, reproductive rights are in the Declaration, and to just bring those out, you know, and raise consciousness of court in appropriate places like that, and of course, especially in federal law cases, and our tribal governments are beginning to implement, you know, bring into their constitutions and into their governments the Declaration. And in that way, that's how you create common law. There's a concept of just causes of, like the Declaration on Human Rights in the UN. It's a declaration, it's not a binding covenant, but it's considered international common law. And so that's nothing with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Well, okay, so we should probably wrap up for the night. I see folks getting kind of tired, and I want to make sure to leave time for people to grab a copy of the book. We have an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for sale over here. Roxanne, I hope, is willing to sign copies.
Books. Yeah.
So please stick around, grab a copy of the book. The cafe is still open. Talk, chat, get to know each other, ask your questions informally, and thank you guys so much for coming out. And Roxanne, thank you so much.
And